right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking to Iulia-Sabina Joja, and she's a senior fellow and director of a Middle East Institute of Black Sea program. And she also teaches European security as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and George Washington University. Hi, Iulia-Sabina.
Hi, it's good to be with you.
So I have the first question, and it's about your general perception of the latest developments in Ukraine. What do you think about them?
Do you mean on the battlefield, politically, in international relations? What do you want me to look at?
Just overall, like general perspective, like let's say on the battlefield, and it's like overall, like political.
Yeah, so I think you were referring earlier before we started the recording to an article of mine that I published at the beginning of the year outlining different scenarios for 2024. And I am afraid that the most pessimistic of them is still a possibility now, almost halfway through 2024. Because of the very limited, restricted, and reluctant aid from the West under US leadership, with a same tendency, particularly from the Biden administration here in Washington, D.C., to be driven by rather fear of escalation than a strategy for Ukraine to win and Russia to be defeated. And because of the absence of all these things, I'm afraid the situation does not look good on the ground in Ukraine. And this is the main reason for it. The aid, as we all know, the supplemental aid from the United States arrived late and is insufficient. And there's heavy restrictions, as everybody already knows, on where Ukraine can strike and how it can defend itself. In the situation now that we're focusing particularly in May 2024 on Kharkiv, the situation is borderline absurd, as I know many in Ukraine feel. The fact that just a few meters further is the border, and Ukraine does not have has the ability, but does not have the support from the West to strike on Russian territory to be able to defend itself. The situation is getting worse and worse. And so the problem, I think, with all of this, I'm guessing the next question is, so how does that look like? I'm afraid, I hate being so pessimistic, but I'm afraid from a political point of view, I do not see the situation, I do not see the possibility for the situation to get better until US elections, because as everybody knows here, everybody's very self-absorbed with what is happening politically. Ukraine, unfortunately, has not become a topic of the election campaign in the way that it should, that the Republican Party could use it against the Democrat Party to say, you're losing, you're not helping Ukraine win. So we want to come back to power to be able to fix that. That's not the case, as we know. And so because of that, and because we've seen so limited political will here in the United States to be able to help Ukraine more, I'm afraid the situation does not look good in the next few months. And unfortunately, as expected, though it's hard for me to admit this, I'm a proud European, like many of us. The Europeans are not following through with the aid that they should be giving, and first and foremost with the leadership, because some of the Republicans are right when they're saying the Europeans should be doing more. It's true, it's a European war, and it's about European security fundamentally. And so I wish the Europeans would get their act together and realize that in a very pragmatic way that it's cheaper and easier to win the war now with the luxury of not having to put boots on the ground from other countries, with Ukraine doing all the hard work. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. are in a much better situation in terms of aid for the country that is being invaded by a superpower than in previous iterations, say World War II instances or World War I. We're more in solidarity with Ukraine than we've ever been with countries in this situation, but it's still not even close to sufficient.
So you're feeling, I mean, the opportunity to stabilize the front is already gone. So it's like the most bleak scenario. You're like scenario 3, a dangerous turn and uncertain future. So we are in this uncertain future scenario then, right? We don't know how it will play out, right?
Well, we're somewhere, I think, between an uncertain future and the bleakest scenario, because we already have seen first in February and now in May, the front lines moving bit by bit with a Russian grinding machine, but nevertheless, they're moving. And Ukraine does not have sufficient defenses, does not have sufficient equipment, does not have sufficient manpower. And even if it had, because we're going into the mobilization debate, even if it had sufficiently trained manpower, what are these people going to fight with? Their bare hands. They just don't have sufficient aid from the West, both Europe and the United States. And so I think we're somewhere between 2 and 3. And unfortunately, I think more bad things need to happen for the West to realize, and the front line to be moving more, for the West to realize how bad of a situation this is and how costly this is. This is the opposite of having a strategic vision, and this is the opposite of cost efficiency, just in pure rational thinking. But I'm already saying things to you that most people in Ukraine, if not all, already know. But in the West, unfortunately, this is not sinking in. This is not an understanding that most people share. Those that do warn about this and have been warning about this are labeled as pessimistic. And whether we are looking at the elections in the United States, truly some of the most important elections of the last century, or we're looking at the European Union with the upcoming European elections and so many European member states having their own elections. I'll give you one example. Romania, the country where I'm from, has a super election year, 4 elections in the same year. This has never happened before. Presidential, parliamentary elections, European elections, and local elections, all the sets that you can have. And this is just one example with everything going on like that, because we're driven by democratic cycles of election, and politicians are programmed to want to win the next elections, and hence pick the topics that are more popular. And certainly war is not a popular topic, and people don't want to talk about it, and they have enough hardship at home anyway. And so with everybody self-absorbed and consumed with their own belly buttons, if I may say that, this means that that the ones that are suffering first and foremost and most are the Ukrainians.
Right. And also, you mentioned about this mobilization issues and lack of equipment and what to fight with. Yeah. And it seems also defense lines are not there. It seems like they haven't managed to build them on time, and Russia's just simply walking over those areas. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these are two different things, right? On the one hand, there's military readiness and defense readiness. And indeed, we've seen over the last few days these reports from villages in the Kharkiv region that the borders were not consolidated, despite having seen reports of the contrary and deep defenses in Kharkiv city itself over the course of March and April. So this is a big problem, and I think the problem here is first and foremost a political one. Indeed, the government will have to explain to in Kyiv, the government in Kyiv, to Ukrainians, but also to the West, how this has happened. So for me, it's too soon to be able to, and I don't have enough data to be able to have analyses about why this has happened and who is to blame. When it comes to mobilization, it's a big dilemma, and I do see voices from the United States, first and foremost, less so the Europeans, particularly senators and congresspeople that have voiced opinions about how mobilizations should occur in Ukraine. In this instance, I have to say that the United States doesn't really have, and this is also for the strategy for warfare, that the United States doesn't have a great track record with force supremacy if we're thinking about Afghanistan and Iraq. So maybe it's not the best to opinionate about how Ukraine should be mobilizing. I know that the topic within Ukraine is very unpopular. It would be in any country. And I know how difficult the process has been for the law to be finalized. And I know that the law is imperfect. But I think that the dilemma here is the following. On the one hand, indeed, Ukraine must defend itself, and Ukrainian men should be showing up to be able to defend their country. But on the other hand, there's also this aspect, and I'm reminded of this. A friend of mine who lives in Ukraine was on a train somewhat recently before Avdiivka fall with someone, with a soldier heading to Avdiivka, who was saying on the train, well, I don't really want to go. And I understand that, and I think people should understand that, because if you're now a soldier in Ukraine going to the front lines to defend the front lines, but the situation politically in the United States and in Europe looks like there's not going to be much more support, but rather that support is fading, that we have fatigue of the war and whatever else you want to call it, you're going to the front lines to defend them from what? And with what? And for how long? If this could lead to Ukraine being forced by the next administration in Washington, whether that's a Biden administration or a Trump administration, to be forced to the negotiation table by saying, we're not going to give you weapons anymore. So then Ukraine has very little choice. And you know that that's a real possibility. It's not really helping with motivation to be able to go now to the front lines and defend them, because again, these front lines could be moving anytime soon. And I understand that with the reports that we're seeing from Kharkiv region and from the borders, that motivation is even lower. So I am of the conviction that Ukraine should be deciding this, and there shouldn't be interference in how mobilization should occur. But beyond that, it's a difficult situation, and it's not just for the government, but indeed it is a whole of society issue.
And it seems like it's a highly demoralized military personnel now, and after the departure of Zaluzhny, there are some rumors that they're not very happy. Commanders not happy to fight under this new military boss, and it's not going very well. Yeah.
Yes, there's that aspect too, but again, I don't have enough data, and I'm not in the Ukrainian military to be able to assess already the performance of the new commander-in-chief. The one thing that I think is important here to mention, again, from where I come from, the perspective of Ukraine support from the outside, there's been mistakes made last year, and I think this is making the situation worse. And Zaluzhny did the best he could with the mistakes that were made independent of him. And I think the mistakes were made on both sides of the Atlantic, in Kyiv, as well as, and it's one of the very few instances where I'm inclined to criticize the government, particularly the president. I generally think that we should be avoiding that because we just don't know as well as Ukrainians how it is to fight and how it is to fight Russia. But in this instance, the mistake was made in Ukraine for lifting expectations too much, increasing expectations, particularly in Washington, where they really need to know better. And the main push here and the main criticism here, the blame is to go to the administration and so-called experts here in Washington, D.C., who have put pressure on Ukraine with very little military equipment and aid, insufficient air power, insufficient air defense systems, insufficient anything to apply what we call NATO doctrine when you don't have the means to do that against a country that is just not a type of warfare that is applicable. To break through a single point and then sacrifice enormously. And my analysis from this, though I don't know all the details, is that Zaluzhny has initially tried very little of this to demonstrate to those that were increasing these expectations that it's just not possible, and then has stopped to do that because he doesn't want to sacrifice his own people in vain. And so I wish that in Kyiv too, but less so in Washington, we would acknowledge these mistakes, that we have tried to force Ukraine militarily to do something that it just didn't have the means to do. But we're not there yet, I'm afraid. And everybody, it's a human thing that we have difficulty admitting our own mistakes.
Right. And do you think that opportunity is missed for negotiations? Because it seems like if, for instance, Trump comes to power and US cuts support, and EU is already having difficulty catching up militarily with Russia, with the Russian Federation, so there will be like some push for negotiation, but already Russians, they seem to be not very interested in it because they haven't military success now, more or less, on the ground, right?
Yeah, it's all true. But look, I'm very wary of negotiations generally, though they will probably happen at some point, in that we all know Ukraine now knows on its own skin. But those of us that come from countries like Ukraine or similar to Ukraine, that have count 10, 20 times that Russia has tried to invade us, Russia, Moscow, call it the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, the empire before, very little difference in Russian ambitions when it comes to going westward. And we all know that when Russia cuts deals and goes to the negotiation table, first of all, it plays unfairly, and second of all, it does not respect its own promises, almost ever, right? And so there will be at some point negotiations, because that's what the West thinks is the right thing to do, and that a conflict must end with that. It's not true. Not all conflicts end with negotiation, but whatever comes out of these negotiations will matter very little, because Russia has not changed its war aims, and that is the cancellation of Ukraine as an independent sovereign country, and then going further west, probably until Berlin, Dresden, where Putin personally came from at the end of the Cold War, right? That's his little dream. And so with that in mind, we might have negotiations and they might violate them all the time, like they did with Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. I wish that the West would finally understand that these agreements are worth very little when it comes to Russia. But this narrative that the Biden administration puts on the table, that we are setting up Ukraine for success at the negotiation table, of course, now has been proven to be false, because Ukraine is in a worse position now on the battlefield than it has been a year ago, because aid has been insufficient, because the war or the aims for supporting Ukraine and defeating Russia have been unclear, because there hasn't been strategic vision, and because at the same time, the more we wait, the more expensive it gets, and the more Russia manages to revamp its military industry and increase production of and imports of military capabilities. And so this is unfortunately a very bleak perspective, but I don't think people are under illusions in Ukraine or anywhere on the eastern flank that a negotiation with Russia will lead to permanent peace and stability, because frankly, we haven't had permanent peace and stability since Moscow started invading West since the 18th century, right? That's how long we're all counting, whether we're looking at Ukraine, whether we're looking at Poland, whether we're looking at all the way to Turkey. Turkey counts, I think, 12 or 14 times it has gone to war with Russia due to Russian aggression.
So you think that Russia's ultimate objective completely take over Ukrainian state and then not stop there, even to move forward, right? Like,
absolutely. They've never said anything different, right? Whether we're talking about Putin or Patrushev or Shoigu or any of Putin's little minions, they've never said anything different. They keep talking about, and Putin himself keeps talking about his imperial dreams and imperial ambitions, and keeps aggressing rhetorically other countries too. So yes, the aim does not. If he would only tell us a few times that his aim is to leave Ukraine alone, that he recognizes the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, then we would have a discussion about whether he's lying or not, right? But so far, he's not even tried to say that. So telling ourselves that he doesn't want to cancel out Ukraine and make it part of the Russian Federation in one form or another, whether that looks like a total annexation or it looks like Belarus, what's the difference? That remains Moscow's and the Kremlin's aim.
Sure, I agree with you. I just wonder what, under such circumstances, can Ukrainian leadership act? Because it seems like Russia also is super efficient in informational warfare. They have managed, I think, in a way to convince public in Europe, especially, about this inability of Ukraine to defeat Russia, stop it, and it seems like now we have less support from European countries, it seems like.
Yeah, it's difficult. Ukraine is in the most difficult position. One idea that I think is worth pursuing and that I wish I would have seen already months ago from the administration in Kyiv is to try to play to play the way that the West wants Ukraine to play, but in its own interest, and to say, look, for Zelensky to first do it privately, but then also publicly, if it doesn't work, to go to Biden and say, look, Mr. President, you are the leader of the free world and all of that. And we want peace. You've given us so much aid to help, but everybody just wants peace. And so I'll tell you what, the way we can achieve peace is by making Ukraine part of NATO. And the way this would look like would, of course, be a negotiation and a compromise, and probably something, that's what I would push for, like Germany during the Cold War. We will never recognize from the Ukrainian side, and neither the other NATO member states, that Ukraine is partitioned, but that certain parts of Ukraine will remain under occupation for the time being by Russia, and that we negotiate with the West, because you cannot really negotiate with Russia, where the fault line falls, and where we can draw a front line, because of course, that's the difficulty, unlike in the Cold War, we have a hot war and the front lines moving. And so this would have to cost significant sacrifices, and it's a very difficult decision to make. But in the absence of anything else that I see on the horizon, this is the best. It's a miserable option, but it's better than nothing, right? It's better than what the worst case scenario looks like. And so to say, this is the way, Mr. President, to pursue peace, and 75 years of NATO is the time to do that. This can be your win, and this can be a guarantee for a somewhat lasting front line and somewhat lasting peace. It's imperfect, and we'll never give up on those territories, but we recognize that we must be bringing peace. And so this is the way to go. And if Biden says, oh, you're not ready, which is what they say. They said that to all member states before they were integrated into NATO. Oh, you're not ready, then you go and make it public and you create more pressure, but you frame it in the way the West wants to frame this, and that is, this is the way to pursue peace, because we want peace, and we know, and the West knows too, that the only way to get peace is to get Ukraine into NATO. And you know, the details can be negotiated, and how do you apply Article 5 to the territory that is under Ukrainian control, and to what extent are you relying on others, etc. But this is the way to go, and I understand that the West is very reluctant to do that because nobody wants to be in a war. But the more time passes, the more the West must realize that we might not want to be in a war with Russia. Russia has been for a long time in a war with us, and if we're looking through the media over the past weeks and months, we see that Russia is now active on the ground on NATO territory with sabotage and espionage, and you name it. It was before either as well, but it's increasing its activities. So this is the only way that I see is possible to frame, to be able to get sufficient support, and it would create a lot of pressure and would have to be sustained pressure, and Ukraine would have to, that's the other thing, get allies on board. The Biden administration might be the hardest one to convince, but it is now, because it's urgent and Trump does not have the same vision of NATO, to get allies, particularly those that have supported Ukraine before in Central and Eastern Europe, to be able to do this lobby at the White House and in Berlin, because these are the two essentially most reluctant actors right now. France and UK have moved strategically significantly in favor of this, and so you need about 10 more countries, small and large, the Baltic countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, and others, Bulgaria too, that will take it up and will call the administration and make the case for Ukraine. So this must be coordinated. And I'm afraid this should have happened before the summit, but it's never too late to try.
Yeah. And it seems like the West is already at war with Russia, and the Kremlin openly claims that they are at war with NATO countries, and they even had this exhibition on those things they acquired at the battlefield. So you think it will be, probably it will be the best case scenario in light of current circumstances. And do you think that there are first signs of that? I've seen some countries like the Baltic countries stating that they are ready to deploy troops. France previously have done it. It seems like there are some steps, maybe some things we don't know yet, about this gradual deployment, not just instructors, but more troops, non-combatant troops, I think they call them, right?
Yeah.
Slowly to stabilize this line and quickly make Ukraine a NATO territory and somehow freeze this, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it rhetorically. I have yet to see the troops. I think Zelensky himself gave an interview in the last few days saying he's seen it rhetorically, but he has yet to see the troops. And so these are important steps. that are taken to sort of break the taboos that are self-imposed by the West, right? We can't be sending troops there. We can't be sending this. We cannot be sending javelins and then medium range, etc. So it's trying to inch towards that, but it will take a lot more effort than that.
Yeah. And do you think that there will be no crisis of legitimacy of Zelensky? Because I've seen some, like on the news, some people speculate that, you know, it's a bad thing. He is already technically not a president. You know, it seems quite risky for Ukrainian stability now that.
Well, you know, Zelensky has performed. I realize that for Ukrainians, he's not perfect, and nobody says he is, but he has outperformed any expectations, not just of him personally, but also of how a president can act in such a difficult situation. And I think that buys him significant political leverage. And then we also have to recognize that Ukraine is a country at war. So you cannot be expecting those that are pressuring Ukraine for elections are dodo birds, frankly, because this is not something that that is doable in as we know logistically in some of the regions. And so indeed, Zelensky needs to try to take on more initiative and to lead the West to an outcome that is favorable to Ukraine. And indeed, Zelensky too has been guilty of, but can you blame him in these circumstances of building expectations very, very high for Ukraine? But that too, I think, is changing now due to the realities on the ground. And so one can always do a better job and one can always do more. But I think he deserves incredible credit for what he has done so far, imperfect as it may be, and Ukraine just doesn't have an alternative to that.
Sure, I see. And just one last quick question. Do you think that if something happens extraordinary and something happens to Putin, it's still, I mean, it's still gonna continue as usual? Because some people say, if he's dismissed, if there's some revolution, that things might change and it will be better for Ukraine. But it seems like this consolidated power will remain. Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm one of those people that come from the Eastern flank and again have lived experience. What I've learned about the Russians, I've learned from my grandmother under occupation, and so did so many of us. And so the problem that we have in Russia is that the alternatives to Putin can be a lot worse than that. And that even the alternatives that never had a political chance, such as Navalny, were nationalistic too, right? We all know what he said about the Caucasus people, what he said about Crimea, etc. And so if we think that someone can emerge anytime soon that is a lot better than Putin and wants to end this war, I'm afraid there's no political capital for that, because the intelligence services in Russia are calling the shots, and their understanding and so-called strategic culture is very well known and not very different from Putin's. And so chances are, as we know, that instead of Putin could come someone that is even more nationalistic, that is even more willing to take risks and wage a war of aggression. And so, of course, nobody likes Putin, you know, but I'm afraid in the case of Russia, we do not have an alternative to Putin that can really offer some credible change in policy.
Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for answering all my questions.
Thank you for having me. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.